One day, my best friend asked me if I can make him a simple, solid, sturdy cutting board with two features. Of course, but what are the features? He said he wants a juice groove, pretty standard, and a juice well. Now, if you think that's excessive, it's not. I've seen him cook and carve a pot roast before, and only one juice well might not be enough. So, I've been working on that, and now I'm working on one for my fiance. Here's how I made it with minimal tools, and you can build this too. For this project, I am making out of a single solid piece of cherry. Now, I don't have a planer or a jointer, so selecting the piece is key to make sure it's as flat as possible. It probably won't be as dead on as it would be with those big milling tools, but it will be close, and that is okay. There are some shallow gouges and marks, but that will be easy to smooth and sand out with the sander. But other than that, this is a solid piece for this project. After choosing the right material, it's time to start chopping. First, I will cut it to length on the miter saw. This piece is too wide for my miter saw to cut all the way through, so I have to flip it and finish the cut. And since I don't have a full miter station to set up with stop blocks, I have to take this part nice and slow to make sure it's as square as possible. Now at this part I made a bit of a goof. I didn't have anything supporting the piece, so I had to tag in my fiance for the help. Big thanks to you for helping me avoid a huge disaster. Here, I just needed to kiss it a little bit on the miter saw. I almost had it perfect. Then, I set up the table saw to rip it to its final dimensions. Now, I spend a few moments checking the square. First, I double check the dimensions. Then, I measured across from corner to corner and make sure it's square. I was about maybe a 30-second off. Then, I use a combination square to check my corner. Next, it was time to sand. I was dealing with some rough stuff, so I started at 60 grit and worked my way up to 220 from there. I did 60, 80, 100, 120, 180, and 220. I made sure to give extra attention to those gouges, but careful not to take off so much material that would be uneven. In between each grit, I made sure to dry wipe the board clean. When I got to 220, I wet wiped it in between each to help pop the grain fibers. This was to ensure as smooth a finish as I could get. I repeated this about 3 times at 220 and twice at 320 with hand sanding. For the edges, I gently shape it with the sander at 220 grit. Then I touch it up with 320 by hand. A trim router would be cleaner, faster, and nicer, but I don't have one, so I gotta work with what I got. Now we move on to the fun part, routing out the juice groove and well. Starting with the groove, I will be using my juice groove jig I got from Rockler. I could have made my own, but I can be pretty lazy sometimes. I use these little blocks as spacers to get the space from the end to the groove that I want. Once I have the jig set up, I hook up my plunge router and get to work. I go barely an eighth on the depth so I don't dig into that hardwood too deep. Also, the shallow pass helps if I make any mistakes. I can just go back over them again. The trick with routing a juice groove is to make sure your jig is tight, square, to go slow, and to keep your router plate in contact with the jig's fence at all times. When you get to a corner, keep the router plate in contact with the fence on both sides when making that turn. That gives you the most control. Also, I turn with the router as I'm going around those turns. That'll give you maximum control. Moving on to the juice well. I'm using various lids to choose the size well that I want. Pickles lid it is. I trace it out and get back to the router work. Honestly, I had no idea what I was doing. This was my first time ever making a juice well. To start, I took a shallow pass along my line to sort of cut it in. I kept doing those curvy passes, but that was taking a really long time. Then I thought, why don't I just make even horizontal passes back and forth like when trying to flatten a slab? So that's what I did. After the routing, I was pretty pleased with the shape and how the depth of the well matched the groove. The material there was very rough, so I started touching it up by hand. I started at 80 grit with a sanding disc, then I stepped up to 120 on a random orbit sander, being sure to hold it at an angle so I don't mess with my edges. Then I got in there really well 220 attached to my oscillating saw. If you don't have a detail sander and you just have an oscillating saw, I highly recommend getting a sanding attachment. Works like a beaut. Lastly, I hit it with 320 by hand. I sanded down, popped the grain with a clean wet rag, and hit it again until I reached my desired smoothness. It took a few iterations of this, but it was well worth the effort. Last step, the beloved oil bath. For this, I'll be using food grade cutting board oil from Howard's. I'll give the board a good wipe and begin. Wait 2 hours and then reapply. Now you're ready to chop up anything with a minimal mess thanks to the Juice Groove and Juice Well cutting board. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe and hit the like if you want to see more. If you like this build, you'll love this money-making build in the box next to my face. Thank you for watching. God bless.